Hello and welcome to our online webinar, Nurturing Emotional Resilience in the Era of Climate Change. This event is presented by UCalgary's Campus Mental Health Strategy and the Office of Sustainability as a part of Mental Health Week and the Climate Conversation series, speaker series. Today we have the honor of hearing from Dekila Chungyalpa, founder of Loka Initiative, and Christy Wilson-Mendenhall, both with the Center of Healthy Minds at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'd like to open this webinar with a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Calgary, located in the heart of Southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. My name is Andrew Zito. I'm the director of UCalgary's Campus Mental Health Strategy. I'm also a mental health and stigma researcher and a professor in the Department of Psychology here at UCalgary. I'd also like to introduce my co-host for today, Dr. Christine Daly, Associate Director of Sustainability Engagement, who currently leads the update of the action plan of UCalgary's institutional sustainability strategy. I think you're on mute, Christine.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, Andrew. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really happy to be part of reflecting on how we can nurture emotional resilience in the era of climate change. You know, it's a topic that comes up a lot across campus here at the University of Calgary while I'm doing engagement. Yeah, I was recently looking at the survey to look at how people across generations experience stress and anxiety. And, you know, the results said that Generation Z experiences stress and anxiety greater than any of the other generations. And that's related to cost of living, climate change, the uncertainty around ecological decline and threats of war. And you know, that really resonates with what I hear from youth around campus, but also from sustainability professionals and those interested in sustainability like myself. So I just think these education and learning opportunities are so important, especially for the older generations, millennials, Gen X and baby boomers who haven't heard about terms like eco grief and eco anxiety yet. So really happy to be here.
Yeah, and you know, as for myself, this is you know, as Christine, you highlighted, this is such an important topic, and this is a topic that I'm starting to learn a little bit more about. I mentioned in Christine's bio that she's leading the update of the action plan for UCalgary's sustainability strategy. And similarly for the campus mental health strategy, we're currently in a kind of a renewal process and renewing our strategy. We have developed a new campus mental health strategy, and it's currently going through the governance approval process. And both, you know, updates of our strategy and this, or the campus mental health strategy and the sustainability strategy. We created a group of elders, our elders leadership circle. And it's composed of Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 elders. And we've worked with this group of elders for about 1.5 years now, and help, you know, getting their thoughts on guiding us through the renewal process and the update process. You know, we've learned so much from them and through their stories and teachings. And one of the teachings that has really stuck with me was when the elders talked about how we're all connected. They talked about connections with each other, connections with the community, but they also talked about connections with land and nature. So you know, specifically what they mentioned that is if the land and nature is not well, then we ourselves will not be well either, right? Our well-being is intimately tied to the well-being of the land and environment. And I think this teaching is really tied to what we're talking about today. So I'm really, really excited to learn from our two presenters. Christine? Sorry, no, I have to go through some technical things first. So I'd like to discuss a couple of technical things before we begin. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and made available after the event. There will be some time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions. You don't need to wait until the end of the talk to send in your questions either. Live transcription has been enabled for this webinar. If you'd like to see it, please click on the live transcription in the Zoom toolbar and then select show subtitles. Now, Christine, off to you.
Thanks. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers today, Dekila Chungyalpa and Christy Wilson Mendenhall. Dekila is the founding director of the Loka Initiative, an award-winning capacity building and outreach platform at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for faith and Indigenous leaders working on environmental and climate initiatives. She has over 2 decades of experience in designing and managing global conservation and climate strategies. Known as an innovator in this field, Dekila received the Yale McCluskey Award in 2014 for creating faith-led environmental and climate partnerships in the Amazon, East Africa, the Himalayas, the Mekong, and the US. She originally hails from Sikkim, a Tibetan Buddhist kingdom turned Indian state in northeastern Himalayas. Christy Wilson Mendenhall is a research assistant professor at the Center for Healthy Minds, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Expanding on effective science expertise developed early in her career, Christy joined the Center for Healthy Minds to advance interdisciplinary research on cultivating well-being and resilience. Christy's research seeks to conceptualize and understand emotional skill sets and how such skills can be cultivated through contemplative practices. This work is grounded in pursuing a contextual, situated understanding of emotional experiences and the conditions under which specific skills may be of benefit. Christy is grateful to work with the incredible interdisciplinary partners and scholars on these complex questions. Dekila, Christy, welcome to our virtual stage and the University of Calgary. I'm really happy to give you the floor and learn more.
Thank you so much, both of you, Christy and Andrew. Thank you to Sasha and Alana Don. We are so grateful to be here and to get a chance to be in this conversation with University of Calgary folks, students, faculty, anyone else who's affiliated in here. Christy and I are gonna tag team and hand our slides back and forth. So please bear with us while we do this. But I'm gonna go ahead and show my slides. Here we go. Let me know, can someone confirm that you are seeing my slides as a whole? And that it looks good? Okay, great. All right, there we go. So I thought I would start by just paying homage to the Indigenous folks of the area that Christy and I live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is known as Dejop. Dejop has a lot of significance for all the tribes here in Wisconsin, and Dejop is essentially the 4 sacred lakes of the Ho-Chunk people in Madison itself. And one of the reasons why we like to start out by, essentially doing a land acknowledgement is to link it to land back and not just have a floating land acknowledgement that sounds pretty, but to emphasize why and how Loka has developed its vision, why the programs that we develop look the way they do. They are very much designed in partnership with Indigenous leaders here, elders, knowledge holders, youth, and also with deep emphasis on reciprocity, interdependence, kinship, all of these Indigenous values that are the reason why 80% of biodiversity today, all over the world, are actually held in Indigenous managed lands. So we really want to make that connection very clear. And while I'm paying homage to Indigenous lands, I'd also like to pay homage to the lands that I come from. This is Mount Kangsidunga. This is in Sikkim in Northeast India in the Himalayan region. And I personally belong to the Bhutia community, the Bhutia scheduled tribe. And for us, land is alive. So this mountain in particular has great significance to us because he is our guardian deity. For the Lepcha community, the Bhutia community, and the Song Limbu community, who are the indigenous inhabitants of Sikkim. So the interesting thing about Mount Kanchenjunga is that he is the third tallest peak on the planet, but almost nobody knows about it, and there is a reason why. Because Kanchenjunga has so much significance to the indigenous peoples, we refuse to allow him to be climbed. And so our communities have fought off all kinds of lucrative deals that have been made to our government. Mountain climbing expeditions, companies, you know, you name it, everyone you can think of who benefits from this kind of exploitative tourism. We have actually fought off all attempts to monetize what we would consider the desecration of this mountain. And so once again, there is this direct connection between indigenous values, indigenous communities, and the way they show up and they put their bodies on the line. And how when we think about what an ecological self is, how much it matters how we view nature, and how we view the earth herself. So I thought a good place for us to start talking about eco-anxiety, climate distress, all of the environmental emotions that many of us are experiencing would be with this picture. This photo was taken in 2006. I was, at this point, the youngest program director, field program director for WWF US, the World Wildlife Fund, which is the largest conservation organization in the world. And, you know, as a brown woman, as at that time, the youngest and the only woman of color who was heading a field program, there was a lot of expectation for me and that I had for myself that I had finally become successful, right? That I'd finally arrived in a sense. And one of the most sort of dissonant experiences in my life was that here I was very much touted as a success, you know, very much put in front of audiences as a representation of what success looks like, while I was experiencing debilitating levels of grief and anxiety around what I was seeing in nature. So what was I seeing in nature? I was seeing forests where I could not hear any birds at all, where you would walk into a forest, it was entirely silent. I was working on climate adaptation for an entire river basin at that time, the Greater Mekong region, and working with a huge team of people, all wonderful, but realizing that what we were working on was not going to change the trajectory that we were experiencing with climate change, but also with hydropower development. And so becoming aware of the immensity and the scale of the problem and the scale of the resistance to any kind of sustainability measures, right? And what that meant was that I had nightmares where I was in the middle of a forest fire, I was the only thing alive, and I'm desperately looking for life. I would have minor, thankfully, panic attacks. I would walk out of meetings sort of sweating suddenly, unable to control my sweating. All of these things were emotional reactions to the reality of being on the ground and being in the front lines of environmental protection. And thankfully, because I'm very talkative, I started talking about what I was experiencing with my peers and learned that I wasn't alone, that actually the vast majority of my team had similar emotions. Now, when I brought this back to DC, where our headquarters was at that time, people literally laughed me out of the room. The idea that environmentalists, environmental professionals, scientists could be experiencing PTSD symptoms was just laughable at that time, right? This is in the mid-2000s. None of these terms exist yet. Eco-anxiety, climate distress, climate grief, solastalgia. We don't know what any of these things mean. All I knew was that people were really having strong emotional trauma responses to the work itself, to seeing climate and environmental impacts in real time. And in my case, because I came from Sikkim and I was raised to meditate, I found that meditating actually helped me with these symptoms. So it was an entirely organic process for me to turn to contemplative practices and to learn from contemplative practices. But this is the personal journey for why I ended up where I ended up and doing what I do now. What is really clear to us now is that everyone is sooner or later going to experience eco-anxiety. What do I mean by eco-anxiety? It is this enormous sort of overwhelming emotional reaction to seeing environmental and climate change, right? The environmental and climate crisis. So that reaction can range from feeling a sense of doom, feeling a sense of hopelessness, anger, rage, frustration, to, completely deactivating emotions where you essentially dissociate and move away, you turn away from environmental and climate issues. These are all emotional reactions to the environmental and climate crisis that if we haven't already experienced, we will sooner or later as environmental and climate impacts affect our personal lives. And so understanding that this sense of woundedness is natural, right? That this is a natural part of us being human beings alive on this planet, and taking in information and reacting accordingly is really crucial. Now, I was very fortunate. I came to UW-Madison and launched the Loka Initiative. Initially, the mission for Loka was that we would serve faith and Indigenous leaders working on environmental and climate issues through this partnership across campus with 7 different schools and entities. So we are able to draw from public health, from environmental science, from women's studies, from religion, and different programs like that, a whole range of programs on campus. But very quickly, our vision was informed by what I'd mentioned earlier, which is having a really strong group of Indigenous advisors. And so our vision became that inner, community, and planetary resilience are interdependent. We cannot achieve any one of these things alone. Our problem is that for so long, we've treated these 3 things as if they are completely disconnected and separate from one another, right? And the reality is there is no way we're going to be able to build ecological resilience if we do not build inner resilience, if we do not fix what is wrong with us inside, right? If we do not figure out how we fulfill ourselves inside, spiritually or psychologically or emotionally. And how do we build inner resilience if our communities are suffering? If our communities are unhealthy, how are we going to be healthy, right? So really making sure that all 3 of these things are part of the same vision, that we see and acknowledge and honor the interdependence among them, and then that we build programs that actually do that. So because of time, we're not going to go into different projects, but it is worth mentioning that in the capacity building activity stream that Loka has, we have a wonderful program where we work with Indigenous elders, knowledge holders, youth here in Wisconsin, and we are launching a documentary called Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Earth that really is going to look at Indigenous resilience. Loka's activity streams are threefold. So we have the capacity building piece, we have research and resource development, particularly around resilience, and then we have the public engagement piece. In the capacity building piece, our criteria for who we worked with has really been who isn't in the room. So it has been, who doesn't show up for COPs, who don't show up for the UN Convention of Parties on Climate Change, who do not come to the big movement events, right? And so ironically, the communities we've ended up working with are really different and interesting, and sometimes not the partners you'd imagine. So one of our strongest projects is with evangelical pastors and church leaders here in the US working on environmental and climate issues. Now, when we talk about environmental and climate issues, we notice that there's a real tendency for people to really focus on a couple. And so we think that it's really important we take a step back and think about the earth herself and think about the systems that actually govern the earth, right? The systems that make up the Holocene, this enormously long period of environmental stability, climate stability that has allowed us humans to thrive, that has allowed agriculture to be possible, right? And so here are the 9 planetary boundaries. I can actually do a close-up that'll give you an idea. So you have biodiversity, you have climate change, novel entities, you have ozone, atmosphere, ocean acidification, biogeochemical flows. That is basically the nitrogen and phosphorus, right? We have freshwater, we have land system change, and then the biodiversity that I mentioned. So these are the 9 categories that we need to be stable for us to thrive on the planet. And the reality today is that we've actually transgressed and crossed what you can imagine as the safe kind of the safety net, right? We've transgressed that and we've crossed that for 6 of them. Now, we are going to focus quite a bit on climate change, but it's worth pointing out that the biodiversity in particular is in full-on crisis. We, since 1970, have lost over 70% of all wild animal, bird, and fish populations. So imagine this in terms of mass, right? 70% mass of all of these populations have disappeared because of us, because of humans. 2 million species are at risk of extinction right now. Another planetary boundary that's really important to track is novel entities. By that, what we mean are all the different kind of manufactured chemicals that we put out into the air, so into the water, into the land. There are 350,000 different types of manufactured chemicals that are completely altering nature as we can imagine it. So I'm sure many of you have heard of or are tracking microplastics, for example, right? There's been a slew of headlines lately showing how microplastics are found in embryos all over the world. Microplastics can be found on top of Mount Everest. It's in the air, it's in the water, it's essentially everywhere. But another example could be PFAS, or what is known as forever chemicals, right? So things that you find in fire retardants, for example, you know, the firefighting sprays that we use. So all of these materials that we are creating, some of them can be naturally occurring and altered, but for the most part, these are harmful chemicals and materials that we're putting out into the planet. So these are different categories of the planetary boundaries that are in full crisis. And so when we imagine solutions, for, let's say, climate change or biodiversity, we really have to take a step back and think about the other 8 areas, right? Because it's really easy for us to fixate on a technological short-term fix for one of these boundaries. But if we want to address the problem holistically, and we want to think about the Earth's 9 systems as a whole, we actually have to change something drastically in our entire systemic approach to living, to well-being, to success, to GDP growth, right? All of these things require a really in-depth change. It requires a sort of a real paradigm shift that's going to be absolutely necessary for life to continue on the planet. Now we come to climate change. So what the reality right now is that we are fully on course for warming to 2 degrees centigrade, if not higher. The last 14 months, we had a steady period in the last 14 to now, I think 16 months, where we have every month on average hit 1.5 degrees centigrade above the 1800s, right, as a level. This is carbon emissions. I apologize. I should be more specific. So the global warming due to carbon emissions has been consistently over 1.5 degrees centigrade above the 1800 levels. So when I say 1.5, that essentially means 2.7 Fahrenheit. Now, if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we have to halve carbon emissions in the next 5 years. The reality is that's not going to happen. And the impact of that is that life as we know it is going to completely change. We cannot be in North America and not see those impacts, right? Whether they are forest fires, whether they are coastal storms, just the heat rises, right? The temperatures, the extreme heat temperature changes in the summer, the changes in climate patterns, rainfall, you name it. Everyone that is in North America in some sense or the other has been adjusting to environmental and climate issues right now. We are so often told that we are the problem when it comes to climate change, right? Whether it is you're in Alberta, Canada, whether it is that we are in Wisconsin, the United States, or you are in China or India or anywhere else, right? In Africa. The reality is that individuals are rarely responsible for climate change. There might be a few of us who own more jet planes than we need to and who are flying around, and there is that 1% that really is doing a lot of damage. But for the rest of us, the 90%, let's say, right? It's really, the reality is that we are part of systems we did not create, and we feel complicit because we have to function in these systems to survive and thrive. However, if you think about it from a nation-state perspective, what you can see is that the 50 least developed countries have contributed 1% of greenhouse gases that have caused global warming up to this point. The US and Europe alone are responsible for over 50% of all carbon emissions in the 20th century. Think about it in terms of companies. 20 companies are responsible for 35% of all carbon and methane emissions. Now, we as consumers may be part of the, be responsible for part of the reason why these companies do what they do, the way they extract and exploit fossil fuels. However, it's really worth pointing out that these companies have been delaying, denying, marketing national and global action for decades, right? Preventing national and global action for decades, while knowing what the impacts are since the 1960s. The largest 5 oil and gas companies spend over $200 million every year in the United States alone doing this kind of marketing and lobbying. I earlier mentioned the 99% and the 1%, so let's talk about that. So here is what the data looks like for the 1%. They are responsible for 15% of all emissions on the planet. If you look at the top, I don't know, the top 10%, let's combine those first two, right? They are responsible for 50% of global emissions, while the bottom 50%, which is the green, is responsible for 8% of all carbon emissions. We have a tendency to think that, or we are often told by these campaigns, that marketing campaigns that were created by these fossil fuel companies, that we as consumers are responsible, right? We are not making the right choices. I'm not going to get into recycling, but recycling is the perfect red herring, we should be doing better, right? However, when you walk into a grocery store, very normal grocery store, what you will see is sort of this plethora, this beautiful kind of facade of diversity, right? That allows us to believe we have choices. But when you walk into this grocery store, what we're not thinking about is that 10 companies actually own everything in that grocery store. The sustainable brands, the brands that we are sort of trying to make decisions about, which has a better environmental footprint, which does not have, anything, a whole range of criteria, which a Marine Steward Council, Forest Stewardship Council, right? All of these things that we as consumers, as individuals, as public organizations, community-based organizations have come up with to demand that these industries change. That the reality is that the industry whole has such a monopoly over the production system, right? And so once again, what I want to emphasize is that we as individuals, the only way we can respond to monopolies like this, the only way we respond to systems that we are forced to participate in, is to band together, is to be in community. I wanted to take a moment to talk about militarism because of what is happening in Gaza right now. There was a really interesting study that came out that just looked at the first 2 months of Israel's attack on Gaza and saw that the planet warming emissions were so enormous that it was greater than the 10 sort of the lowest emitting countries in the world. And if I'm going to talk about Israel, I have to talk about the US, because we know that the US is responsible for a lot of Israel's ability to attack, to bomb, to destroy the ecology, the communities, the people, the lives, children's lives in Gaza right now. So the US military in particular uses more oil, emits more global house gases than most mid-sized countries. And I'm not talking about countries in Africa or Asia. I'm talking about Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, all of the European countries, right? If the US Defense Department was a state, it would be the 47th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. We have not talked about the military for a very long time in the environmental and climate movement, because we were told not to for a very long time. And this goes back to the Kyoto Protocol. We actually, as an environmental movement, had so much pressure on us from the governments that the environmental movement basically put blindfolds on and said, we will not assess what the military is doing, right? What all around the world, all of the militaries. However, we know that there is enormous greenhouse gas emissions that all of these militaries create. We know that there is an enormous ecological impact from the bombs, right? We are completely destroying ecosystems. We're destroying trees. We're destroying all species, right? Putting aside the moral I will say the moral injury that is done to us when we are forced to witness what our governments are doing, putting aside the loss of life, right, that is happening in Gaza, in Sudan, in other parts of the world. And so we are at a crisis point in the environmental movement if we do not address militarism, if we do not address the military-industrial complex. It is absolutely morally urgent that we take this on and we find the wherewithal, we find the courage to start talking about what the environmental and human rights impact of militarism is, and that in the environmental movement, we have to speak up on this. So having said all that, I really want to also center children, right? One of the most interesting dialogues I've been in the last few years has been with the American Psychological Association, looking at mental health of young children, with children's museums in the United States and elsewhere, trying to think about how do we protect the resilience of children who are aware of what is happening around them and who no longer have buffers that many of us grew up with, right? Thinking the adults will fix this, or this is an adult problem, or thinking that there is someone in charge. What we see now with young people in particular is that all of those beliefs have eroded away. They do not have faith that other people are going to fix the problem, and they feel this enormous sense of responsibility and enormous sense of betrayal, that they are forced to take on roles they do not wish to, right? Non-childlike roles where they are forced actually to show up as leaders. And so this is a quote that I use all the time from Greta Thunberg, because she talked about something that a lot of young people have experienced, which is realizing a kind of falling into depression, realizing that the environmental and climate crisis is going to destroy their future. And it is also worth emphasizing that in the case of Greta, she as an individual took action and ended up creating a movement that has actually really galvanized climate action around the planet, that has really provided the impetus for climate policy. And so once again, you know, there is only so much we can do when we experience the reality of the world that we face. It can feel really overwhelming. It can feel very scary, but the reality is that we can actually act in a way that is true to our own value system, and find other people that matter, that are like-minded community members, and take action together. One of Loka's focuses really is on justice. We take an intersectional approach towards all of our programs, and something we really like to emphasize when we talk about emotional resilience in particular is this idea that there isn't an equal proximity to suffering. BIPOC people are the people that have been experiencing environmental racism for generations, right? Since Canada was created, since the United States was created, especially Indigenous folks and Black folks in these countries have really suffered from, you know, the loss of land, the loss of livelihoods, loss of health, air pollution, allergens, lung, heart health. All of these issues have really been borne by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in North America. And so the idea that eco-anxiety and climate distress is going to be equally distributed is unrealistic. The reality is that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are experiencing higher levels of eco-anxiety and climate distress. This is something that the data shows us consistently. This is something that we, Christy and I, are actually working on in our research as well. One of the programs that Loka launched last year was Resilience in the Anthropocene. We started with an online summit last year with 40 experts from all around the world, really looking at inner resilience, community resilience, planetary resilience. And that was the first time we introduced 3 contemplative practices because we knew these topics were heavy. So we had 3 contemplative practices that we mixed in there. It was sort of, the event as it goes was really successful. We had 1,700 people sign up, a lot of feedback, a lot of people were involved. It was community co-created, so there was a lot of dialogue and engagement. And what became really obvious to us was that we really needed to build the contemplative practice angle of it as well. People really resonated to that. And Christy is going to talk a lot more about the science of how contemplative practices help us regulate our emotions. But during these 3 days, one of the things that became very obvious to us was that we really needed to pause in between some of these really heavy dialogues. We needed to pause and just listen. We needed to be quiet. We needed to really take on deep listening skills as speakers, as moderators, right? As behind the scene organizers. And that this actually goes back to the original vision of connecting inner community and planetary resilience. So once this event was over, we probably took about 6 months to figure out what we were doing. But what we have done now is come up with a series of programs that we can share with you in a moment. People often ask me why Loka emphasizes resilience, the term resilience. Particularly womanist scholars and experts I know and love and respect have raised how resilience can be problematic because so often Black women in particular are asked to be resilient without any structural and systemic support, right? The systems are not designed to help Black women or Indigenous women or women of color, but then the emphasis is given to us that we should be responsible for our own resilience. And so resilience as a term can be complicated. Loka emphasizes resilience because, one, it means the same thing in different fields. We really are intrigued by the fact that resilience, this ability to bounce back in the face of after adversity, right? The ability to adapt well to trauma. It means the same thing whether you're talking about it psychologically or sociologically or ecologically. We also really are aware of the fact that one of the things about resilience that matters is the implication that things do not go back to the way things were. Given what we know about climate change, things will not go back to the way things were. We are in a time of uncertainty. We are looking at imminent collapse, right? So how do we build our inner resources? How do we build our community resources? How do we build ecological resources that we need to keep the ecological systems going, right? We actually need this ability to adapt to new circumstances, to new changes, to new futures. And so that is one of the reasons why resilience is so important for us as a term. And finally, I think what is worth mentioning about resilience is that it is something that requires community. We cannot be resilient alone. There is no person that can go off into the woods. I sometimes hear, particularly men, use this term, I'm just going to go off into the woods and build my own cabin and just forget about the rest of the world. That is not a resilient response. A resilient person requires a family, a community, friendship, connections, social relationships, right? Resilience even from a climate adaptive perspective is going to require that we band together. And so I'm going to pause here and hand it over to Christy. Christy, I'm going to stop sharing and then maybe you can share the slides. Okay.
Thanks. Oh, excuse me. Thanks, Dekila. Okay. That look good? All right. So good afternoon, everybody. So as was mentioned in the intros, I'm a research assistant professor at the Center for Healthy Minds at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm really grateful to be here with you today. I'm also just really grateful to work at a center with the mission of cultivating well-being and relieving suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind, with the vision of a kinder, wiser, more compassionate world. And also to work in a place that is so multidisciplinary. So my desk is, about 15 feet from Dekila's. And we got to talking one day and really just saw the opportunity to integrate our respective expertise. My background is in psychological science and specifically affective and contemplative science, with Dekila's expertise as an amazing environmental professional and leader and a contemplative practitioner, to really advance a line of research on promoting, as Dekila said, inner resilience in relation to community and planetary resilience. So I'm going to actually start with some data to show you that actually illustrates a lot of the points that Dekila was just referring to. So the studying the emotional and psychological impacts of climate change and environmental crises has not received a lot of attention historically, but really in the last few years, we've seen research on this just accelerate a lot. And so we're starting to see really rigorous kind of large-scale global survey studies. And so I want to start with a recent study of 10,000 children and young adults ages 16 to 25. And so these, the children and young adults that participated in this study were living in the countries that you see in green here. So 1,000 participants from each of these 10 countries. And one of the first questions that they asked in the survey was, what emotions they were experiencing around climate change. And so this shows the most frequent emotions that people were reported experiencing. And you can see that these are really high numbers, right? These are a proportion of respondents. So, we're up in sort of close to 65% here reporting feeling afraid and sad, anxious and angry and powerless and helpless. All of those emotions, the majority of participants are reporting experiencing. They saw similar findings when they asked about how worried they were about climate change. So around 60% were also reporting that they were very or extremely worried. And similar numbers of people reporting that they really felt betrayed by the governments in terms of how they are handling their response to climate change, which makes sense, right? It provides some understanding of why they're experiencing these kinds of emotions. And then they also asked about how these feelings, if these feelings were negatively impacting their daily life. So they're experiencing these feelings, what impact is it having on your daily life? With the question referring to impact of at least one of what you see in this list right here on the right. So really having an impact on something that's going on a daily basis. And 45% of participants in this study responded yes. Those feelings that I reported in response to that first question are having a negative impact, you know, in my daily life. And then I want to show this broken down by country, because I think it illustrates some of the points that Dekila was really raising about inequity. And so that 45% number that I just showed you is here in green. That's across all countries. But you can see that these numbers differ quite a lot across the 10 different countries, right? And so I've highlighted countries in the global south here in the darker blue, and countries in the global north in the lighter blue. And so you can really see a clear difference, right? That the burden, these emotional burdens, the impacts on daily life are much higher for young people in the global south due to current and historic inequities. So this data really illustrates a lot of what Dekila was talking about the importance of bringing an intersectional lens to how we think about studying the emotional impacts of climate change. And so really the first step in studying the psychological distress, studying these emotional impacts, is to really understand what people are experiencing. And again, for us, the way that we approach this, it's so important to do this through an intersectional and justice lens, to understand that these burdens are disproportionate, right, for some groups and communities. And so really understanding how these experiences vary for different people, and to approach this research through the climate and social justice principle of procedural rights. So procedural rights is that opportunities are afforded to the people most affected by climate change to participate meaningfully in development and implementation of responses to the climate crisis and environmental crises. And this applies also to how we respond and think about promoting emotional resilience and supporting mental health. And so these are, the words presented on the screen here just illustrate the variation in psychological distress that people can experience, right? And so really trying to understand how that varies across different people and even within a person. So really understanding the different emotions that someone is experiencing and the context of their experiences. And so at the same time, so doing that work to really understand what people are experiencing, the distress they're experiencing, again, of course, with the goal of understanding how to offer emotional support that really is going to resonate with them and be meaningful and impactful. And that's work that Dekila and I are starting to do together. And at the same time, really thinking about leveraging research and what we've learned from affective and contemplative science that's been going on for decades, to be able to offer tools and resources that may help now in the moment. And so one we can think of as sort of a tool or a resource that emerged actually in affective science that was investigating and trying to understand variation in emotional experiences is the idea of emotional granularity. So emotional granularity is the ability to make fine-grained distinctions in our emotional experiences. So for example, being able to distinguish or differentiate when you're feeling sad versus afraid versus exhausted versus lonely, right? Being able to make those distinctions. And it turns out that people vary quite a lot in this ability. And so someone who is lower in granularity often just experiences feeling bad without those types of distinctions that I just described. And this is in part because this is something we learn, right? This is something that we have to learn how to do. And this is really a process of lifelong learning. This is not static. It's not something that a skill that you develop and then you just have it, right? Because life is constantly presenting us with new situations and new emotions that are arising. And so it's something that we're sort of constantly learning. And what the research in affective science has been showing is that greater emotional granularity is consistently associated with better coping in mental health. So just to give you a few examples of that, people who demonstrate or show greater emotional granularity tend to be more flexible in their emotion regulation. So, knowing and identifying the emotion that you're experiencing then helps you navigate that emotion, right? And choose a coping strategy that might be best for that particular situation. People with greater emotional granularity then are less likely to adopt coping strategies that might actually be not as good for our health. So they're less likely, for example, to drink when stressed. They're less likely to retaliate aggressively. So we're seeing consistent evidence of the benefits of emotional granularity, which opens up the question of how we learn to be more granular about our emotions. And so I'm going to touch on just a few ingredients that can play a role in learning to be more granular. And the first one that I'm going to touch on is allowing or accepting. And so I just want to start with this quote from Elizabeth Marks, who is a clinical psychologist and actually one of the authors on that study of young people that I started with. And she writes, "These climate emotions are actually something to be honored and allowed, not pushed away." So, sometimes when we experience distress, when we experience a negative emotion, and we're in an unsafe situation, we're acting on that emotion right away. We need to get to a safe place. But sometimes when we're in a safe place and distress emerges, emotions emerge, anxiety emerges, for example, our tendency of our brain is to kind of push that away, to avoid it, right? Because we don't want to feel bad. We want to feel good. But what we're learning through affective and contemplative science is that this process of accepting our feelings without trying to control or judge them, so this allowing, this honoring, not pushing them away, but just being able to sit with them without judgment, really helps us then step into navigating those emotions. And so this is actually a little bit of data that was not focused on ecological emotions. This was focused just on emotions generally. But in this study, people were practicing the skill of kind of accepting their feelings without trying to control or judge them for a couple of weeks. And then they came into the lab and they were exposed to a social stressor. And so you can see the people who were practicing this acceptance are in this black line here. And so you can see everyone was, stressed by the stressor. But what you see is less reactivity here for the group that had learned this kind of acceptance practice. So again, a way in really to navigating those emotions and really to learning, right? If we push away our negative feelings and emotions, it's really hard to learn about them. And so really sort of opening the space to learn and explore what's going on, what these negative emotions are that we're experiencing. And so there's more and more research on climate emotions specifically. And so this is work by Panu Pikala, and he has kind of created this climate emotions wheel of emotions that have been sort of frequently reported, that people frequently report experiencing here, with the idea that, again, like starting to learn and explore these emotions, we can look at this wheel and start to think like, what is it that I'm experiencing here? And then I think the other thing that we're seeing is that this sort of building of a shared contextual language, right? So when we're talking about anxiety, having words that indicate that we're talking about eco-anxiety, that we're talking about the distress caused by climate change, where we're becoming really anxious about the future. I think Dekila mentioned also, the concept of solastalgia. So the distress that's sometimes described as homesickness that people experience due to changes in the landscape that people call home. So these changes to the land. And so the building of this shared contextual language not only helps us identify the emotions that we're experiencing, but also helps us to communicate, right? To talk about those emotions with other people. Glenn Albrecht his book on this actually is titled New Words for a New World. And what we've seen mainly is that these new words are really focused on distress, right? But you can think about a shared contextual language that goes beyond distress, that also helps us think about what flourishing and resilience looks like when inner resilience is connected to community and planetary resilience. And then, once we have more of this language, then when we experience an emotion, it allows us to name what we're feeling. And what we've learned from affective science studies is that putting our distressing feelings into words can really reduce the initial surge of reactivity that we feel. It's sort of a foothold again to working with our emotions. And so there's been a lot of studies in the lab kind of looking at this naming, what is called affective labeling. And interestingly, a recent study looked at use sentiment analysis to look at emotions on Twitter. So they actually identified for Twitter users when a user explicitly reported experiencing a negative emotion. So I feel, and then an emotion like sad or angry. And what they saw is that you sort of see this downward spiral of negativity. And then at the point where they actually name the emotion, you start to see that kind of recovery. So that naming can really be helpful in the process of navigating our emotional experiences, our feelings, and becoming more granular. And then I think the other thing that's studying emotional experiences in this domain as related to climate change and environmental crises is bringing to affective science is really the complexity of a lot of emotions, right? That it's not that we are seeing our distress go away. Of course, our distress is not going to go away, right? Because we're in crisis. But understanding the complexity that can emerge within emotions that may be more positively oriented. And so hope is an emotion that we're seeing a lot of really kind of intriguing work around right now. And so I wanted to share a little bit of the research on this with you. So this is a study where climate researchers were asked to write a letter about how climate change made them feel. And probably not surprisingly, like the vast majority of their language, the emotional language that they were using was very negative. And the most frequently used positively oriented emotion was hope. And in their coding, what was interesting, so when they went in to actually code the data, they realized that there was a lot of complexity around how climate researchers were using hope. So they actually distinguished these two types of hope: wishful hope, in which the researchers were really talking quite negatively about the global situation and using hope as a reference as a desire for future change that's needed. And logic-based hope, which was more rooted in hope as a reflection of current changes, so seeing some positive political and attitudinal changes. And so climate researchers contributed these letters, and then a subset of them did this a second time 5 years later. And so you can see both forms of these hope are kind of referenced in the first round, and then there seems to be a shift more towards this wishful hope of really focus on needing future change. And then we're also seeing, I think, really, really important work on what's been called radical hope in communities of color. And so this is a framework of hope that has been developed by a group that's been focused on developing a framework of radical healing. This is a group of scientists and scholars who are, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And two of the really important dimensions in their framework of radical hope is this collective orientation. And so really it being grounded in community. So thinking about a shared past of a particular community, and here the focus in this particular qualitative research was on ethnic and racial communities, and having a shared past of understanding together that shared past of not only oppression, but resilience and resistance, and how that hope is really grounded then, that really grounds hope in wanting to contribute to the community, to give to the community moving forward. And then this other dimension of faith and agency. And so faith really being faith that, faith in a better world, that we can, to make changes to produce a better world, and the agency of, so envisioning that possibility, and the agency of actually taking steps towards that vision. And so, those examples of hope are really examples of thinking about how we cultivate, how we sort of work with and transform into nourishing emotions. Again, like, we're not getting rid of the distress, but we're layering to sort of build our experiences, build these kind of complex experiences that help nourish us to survive and to work towards a better world. I also just want to acknowledge here too that the examples of hope, again, were sort of related to growing out of experiences of distress, but also to think about what brings joy, right? Thinking about all of the research we're seeing on experiences of awe in nature and how healing those experiences can be. So cultivating and seeking out those experiences too are really important. And again, of course, coming back to the point that we started with of having a intersectional and justice lens here. So really needing to understand what different people are experiencing, how these emotional experiences are varying. And then, I think often when we talk about this sort of inner work, right? We tend to then start to focus on individuals, but how important it is to do this work together in community. It can feel really isolating, especially when you feel like you're having emotions that other people are not having. So Dekila mentioned, the moment when she started to talk to her team about this and realized that she wasn't alone, that other people were experiencing this. So the importance of connection and emotional support, being integral to navigating eco-anxiety, climate distress, and other earth emotions. And this is what we're seeing is actually seems to be a really important component in the research that's been done before, this community aspect in navigating eco-anxiety. So the same way that we think about building community for collective action, also having community to process our emotions, to heal, and to build resilience together. And then finally, we're seeing some evidence that then taking also the step of collective action together can actually be, for people who are experiencing high levels of eco-anxiety, can be a buffer to prevent kind of serious mental health symptoms. So this is a study of university students, and what you can see here is that people who are experiencing high levels of climate anxiety, when they're engaged in climate activism, they have lower levels of depression symptoms than when they're not engaged in climate activism. And this effect was specific to collective action versus individual action. So the power of being in community to, make space for our emotions and navigate those emotions together, as well as act together. And so my last slide here is just, I'm so grateful. It's been so meaningful to work with Dekila and the Loka team to start to build and think about a program of research and to outline some research priorities for ourselves. And I think, what sort of ties together everything that we're interested in is really just wanting to meet people where they are, right? So, nurturing emotional resilience among those most impacted and burdened by climate and environmental crises, wanting to understand how these emotional journeys, distress, but also resilience and joy, vary across people, to develop assessments that capture this diversity in emotional journeys, and then to investigate a variety of contemplative practices. So Dekila is going to speak a little bit more, but contemplative practice that draw on many of the ingredients that I was just sharing with you to really understand, what works for whom, how these contemplative practices may be supportive, and understanding that, probably different practices are going to work for different people. And with that, this is important. So before I turn it back to Dekila, we have received initial grant support, and we're really super excited to be hiring a postdoc opportunity. So if anyone is listening is interested in coming to work with us, or knows someone who would be interested in coming to work with us, please share this with anyone who would be interested. And Dekila, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christy. That was so fun for me. I learn something new every time. This is the interactive part of the presentation. What we really wanted was to give you the opportunity to share your emotions with us and to essentially, let's start this conversation, right? So you should be able to see the QR code on the left side. You can use your phone, just sort of scan it, open your camera on your phone, scan it. It'll allow you to enter this active poll. Or if you're on your desktop, you can just go to slido.com, put in that number, and then start telling us. And I can see 3 participants. I've figured it out already. And so you can start putting in the emotions that you are experiencing. And we thought we could have a dialogue around that. And maybe if there is time, a contemplative practices that addresses some of these emotions. As you can see, there's a whole wide range of emotions that people are putting in, right? The first point we want to make is that you are clearly not alone. So you can see, you can tell whichever are the bigger numbers, whichever are highlighted, whichever is the bigger word. That is, every time you have more people who are putting in the same word, that word in the word cloud, that word just sort of increases. So that gives you an idea of how many people are experiencing the same emotions. And so the first point is you're not alone, right? The second point around these emotions is that your emotions are valid. There's a reason why you're experiencing these emotions. You are seeing an existential threat to your well-being. You're seeing an existential threat to your loved ones, right? That we have evolved to respond to. And so the emotions you experience are completely valid. You are responding as you are supposed to. And I think the third point, which I feel like Christy and I have both been hammering throughout this talk, is that it really matters if you are in community. If your emotional well-being, your resilience is going to be so much stronger if you join a community, if you see yourself as being part of a movement, if you are acting in group, right, in mass. As I said earlier, it is the only way to respond to systems that are monopolistic, that are extractive and exploitative, right, that see us individuals as something to exploit and extract from. The only way we can practically respond is in community. That's where our power comes from. But psychologically, as Christy pointed out, being in community actually gives us the boost, the emotional boost that we need to build our resilience. And so that is another aspect of what we are talking about that we really hope you take away. I thought that there were maybe 3 points that I could emphasize before we close and turn it over to Q&A. So the first part is, it is really worth remembering, as an environmentalist, this is probably one of my favorite things to think about, is that the Earth is a closed system. Of course, there is a little bit of matter that comes through and, comes through, but ultimately, we have the atmosphere, we have the lithosphere, and we have the hydrosphere, right? So we have the air, the land, and the water. And other than a few meteors, nothing really enters or leaves this area. So everything you can imagine, when you look at this beautiful marble, everything you can imagine, our lives, the people we love, the people we hate, from beginning to end, our experience as humans on this planet happen here. The people that hate us, the people that love us, the people we love, the people we hate, all of that happens here, right? And that the beauty of life is that we are born, we live, we thrive, and we die. And then we decompose and we get to be part materially of this planet again and again and again. That we are constantly part of a renewal of life that happens on this planet. The second thing that I want to mention, and a shout out to Christy Belcourt, who's one of my favorite artists, she's Métis, she's in Canada, is that while the Earth is a closed system, within the Earth, all of its ecosystems are actually kind of open. It's really hard to pinpoint a point in an ecosystem and say, aha, this is where marine ends and this is where terrestrial begins, or this is where a wetland ends and this is where land begins, right? That there is a huge amount of flow that's happening in and out within all of the systems we can imagine, including ourselves, including us as human beings, as systems, right? There is no point where you can just pinpoint to yourself where the oxygen ends and you begin within your own body. It's impossible. And so we live in interdependence. We exist through interdependence. And then finally, that everything rests on something else. We as humans couldn't thrive if bees did not exist, right? If bees disappeared from our planet, 1/3 of our agriculture would collapse within one agricultural cycle, right? And so everything on this planet has been designed so that we rest on something else. And I think taking these 3 points to emphasize that we need community, we need to be in a give and take with nature, and we need to think about community well-being and community resilience as part of our inner resilience is really, really important, and the main takeaway, I think. Christy talked about the postdoc and the research. I thought I would end by talking about the psychology of resilience. So after we had the event that we talked about, and we took 6 months to figure out what we were doing, we decided to work with many of the presenters and speakers, and actually somebody in our audience as well, and create this 4-course certificate program on edX, which is one of the largest online learning platforms. It's completely free. And so there are 4 topics: resilience in the Anthropocene, Earth Principles, which is about the science, emotional resilience and ecological self, which is really about the psychology, and then cultivating connection and community, which now you know is about community. The cool thing about it is that we are offering 15 contemplative practices to work with, where people can take what they want to apply and analyze themselves and their emotional granularity as they go. And so as you do a module, you're offered one of these practices, but you can pick something else. And there are three wisdom traditions that we're drawing from. So there is Buddhism, with some mindfulness emphasis in it. There is indigenous land-based healing, nature-based, nature immersion exercises, and then somatics, which is essentially movement, right? Using movement to come to a contemplative sort of equilibrium. And so there's a whole variety of practices, including breath and song, by Desiree Dawson, whom some of you might know, who I believe is in Canada too. And so a whole range of practices that we offer. I thought that would be a good point to end and see if we have questions, and hopefully we have time for questions. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for both of you for such a great talk, and really I really appreciate the messages. The community message is so important, I think, here. Both our strategies, the sustainability as well as our campus fidelity strategy, really focus on the value of community and really having that community resilience, right? I think it's important to have the individual resilience, but then also have that community to support each other as well. Now, we do have a little bit of time. I know we want to end off with a contemplative practice, maybe for the last 5 minutes or so. Well, I think we have some time for a couple of questions, and there are some good ones that are coming out right now. We have some educators in the room here, and one of the questions is that the educator is asking, I'm super cautious when engaging with emotions in the classroom. I'm not trained to support students in this way, although probably should be to some degree, and I'm worried that opening the door to discussion about ecological emotions could put students and the person itself in situations where could do more harm than good. So this person is wondering if you have any advice on to prevent harm from this being done, or what are some thoughts, if you have any thoughts about that specific question.
Christy, I think this one's yours.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. So I think first of all, whenever you're going to get into sort of emotional topics, it's important to build, first of all, a community of trust with your students. So that really just starts with getting to know them beyond the work that they're doing. So often students walk in and they come into the classroom and you're just focused on like the content of that class, right? But getting to really know them as whole people, that they feel like they can walk through the door with their whole selves. They can bring their whole selves into the classroom. And I think just laying that foundation first, right, of like having conversations about, that get into things beyond the classroom, that kind of bring in their background, their stories, their personal experiences. So I think that foundational part is really important before trying to jump to talking about emotions. That's, in my experience, that's been hugely important in the kind of communities that we try to build. And then the second, I think, is just really having resources available for students. So, knowing if there are climate aware therapists, for example, in the area, understanding like if a student is really distressed, being prepared to make sure that they have sort of the resources they need when they leave your classroom. So those are the two things that I would offer. I don't know, Dekila, if you have other thoughts too.
I think there's just a great deal of healing in knowing that you're not alone. So even if it is just having a conversation about emotions and how common some of these emotions are, I think that'd be really, really worthwhile. You don't have to fix the emotions, right? Some of them are not fixable really, because the point of distress is continuous. This is not a one-time distress, and we don't have time to get into this, but the nature of PTSD or trauma is often it happens one time in the past, but this is not what's going on with climate change, right? It's going to be continuous. And so having a mindset where you don't think of yourself as the fixer is really important, especially with young people. But I also think sort of pushing them towards action is really helpful for them, because what you're doing is channeling their emotions towards activities that matter and telling them that, these are activities that actually contribute towards solutions. I think that is also a really wonderful way of addressing what they're experiencing and taking it seriously. making it obvious that we take it seriously. Yeah. Sorry, such short time.
No, I think we still have a little bit more time for a couple more questions, or one or two more questions. Christy, you talked a little bit about, you talked quite a bit about the research. It sounds like this is an emerging topic of research. How eager or responsive are climate organizations to research this type of topic, or initiatives geared towards climate emotions and mental health? Do you see this as something that's an up and coming topic?
Yeah, and I'll let Dekila respond to this too, but yeah, I mean, we definitely get a lot of requests to come and talk with different organizations about this. I think especially, I think it's becoming more widespread. People are more familiar with terms like eco-anxiety, right? And these feelings are just getting talked about a lot more. And I think people are really starting to recognize, how harmful the mental health impacts can be, and wanting to do something about it. So I can't speak, Dekila might be able to speak more, have a better sense of like the continuum, like all of environmental organizations, but
yeah. So we get invited quite often now to give talks with and to work behind the scenes with some of the staff of environmental organizations. I really want to do a shout out to the Whole Foundation, which has funded some of our research in this, because they also have funded a lot of the well-being programs in environmental and conservation NGOs in North America in general. At the same time, I've also been doing a lot of pushback because we created the course thinking this is something that would, it's free, it's all around, it's in 70 countries, it's all around the world. It's sort of, brilliant minds and experts and people on the ground really who know their stuff, who are going to make this available. The course will launch end of this month in May. And so we will be sure to send you a link. And if you can share that with your audience, that'd be great. And I think we thought that a lot of the environmental NGOs would be very excited about that. But the feedback has been fascinatingly neoliberal, which is, can we hire you to just work with our NGO and not the other NGOs? And so there is something really fascinating in how even, the anti-establishment reacts in the most established, extractive, exploitative way, because this is essentially what we've been conditioned to do, right? So it has opened this broader conversation about how we in the environmental movement need to come together to address mental well-being of environmental professionals.
So we do have lots of questions, but we want to finish off with a contemplative practice, and then Christine will finish off and end our webinar. So Dekila, would you lead us in that practice?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I apologize about not being able to get to all the questions. Feel free to reach out to Christy and me, and we will do our best to respond by email. And so the tradition I'm going to draw from is Tibetan Buddhism, which is my tradition. And I noticed that some of the emotions, let's name them, that came up, especially fear, was really high. Hopelessness, I remember showed up, anxiety showed up, sadness and anger. So let's do a practice that you can take everywhere with you and that you can work with no matter where you are, and it can even be a micro moment in the future, right? So let's try something with that. So the first thing I want you to do is align your bodies. That means that you kind of shrug your shoulders back, you straighten your back, straighten your spine. You can visualize a string that's pulling you from the top of your head straight, right? And then you let the string go. So when you let the string go, what happens is you slowly relax into your body. And it's a really good moment to just be aware of your body and be aware of how it works for you, how it's endlessly, day in, day out, trying to meet what you want it to do, right? So it runs, it walks, it works, it lifts, it carries, it moves, constantly for us. And so just a moment of gratitude and acknowledgement. Our body is our primary home. We are always home in our body. And so as we are aware of that emotion, we can just sort of allow ourselves to expand and inhabit our body, right? As opposed to kind of pushing forward, pushing it to do things, let's take a moment and just relax. And take a very deep breath. Visualize that you're filling your belly first. So take a breath. Allow it to fill your belly. Breathe out. Empty your belly. Deep breath. Imagine where this oxygen goes. Can go to everywhere you feel any kind of stress or tension or pain in your body. Just let it go there. Last breath here. And as you feel more centered, more awake, I want you to take your awareness and just let it flow down your body into wherever you are connected with the earth. It could be through your feet, through your thighs, through your bottom, wherever that point of contact is. It doesn't matter if you're many stories up or you're sitting in a chair. See how you're pressed on the earth and how the earth is holding you up unconditionally, effortlessly, compassionately holding you up. And so you can just think about this emotion that you raised earlier, right? The emotions that came up for you, and allow it to flow through you into the earth. You can just offer it to her and she will absorb it. That point of suffering is something you can release. It's really easy to get attached to our points of suffering. And so just visualize letting it go. And sometimes it helps to imagine cutting it off, right? But you're just offering it. And now, once you've done that, take in a deep breath and think about where the oxygen that you're breathing is coming from. It can be phytoplankton from oceans far away, or the lakes nearby, forests, trees, plants in your room, wetlands, oxygen that has traveled thousands of miles to come to you to give you life. The food that you've eaten today has come from all over the planet. The water you're drinking has come from all over the planet. The earth wants you to live. The earth unconditionally, lovingly, compassionately wants you to thrive, like all other species that she has given birth to. You are never alone. You are part of all life on the planet, giving and taking. You are always part of the community, always part of life's community on the planet. And so whenever you feel overwhelmed, you can drop your emotions into the earth and just remind yourself that she wants you to thrive. All the conditions are here for us to be awake to being in this loving community. This is what it means to be aware of your ecological self. And so I invite you to take this practice with you wherever you go, however rough things get, right? However impossible the situation might be, your emotions are running high, people are not listening, it's frustrating, it's hard. Just take a moment, because this is where fearlessness comes from. It comes from remembering this relationship with the planet and knowing that you're not alone. You're always part of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dekila and Christy, for your fearlessness, both of you. This concludes our webinars. Thank you again. That was for such a beautiful practice. On behalf of our campus mental health strategy and Office of Sustainability, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Stay tuned to your email for the event recordings, as well as for the resources and readings. I want to share again, just a big thank you to Dekila and Christy for joining us and sharing their immense knowledge during such a really insightful and moving presentation webinar. Thank you. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.